Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of our Brothers Creed podcast, where we talk about motivation, experiences, and this time explore what the world has offered.
Has already offered.
Yeah, has already offered. Today we're going to be talking about this great country, some of its founding fathers, and some true American heroes. So we're the Thomas Brothers. I'm Ethan.
I'm Jared.
And this episode is actually going to be released during the week of the U.S. presidential election. So November 4th is the election day, and we're excited about it.
Yeah, definitely excited. I think that this is a time in our country where there's a lot of division, and so we decided to do an episode about kind of those American heroes around the time of the American Revolution. That's far enough back where I think most people can agree that a lot of people sacrificed some good stuff, and we just want to kind of do an episode that would unite people and kind of show that whether you're on the left or the right or in the middle, that there's a lot of good out there, and that as we learn about these heroes and what they've done for us, then we can apply some of that in our own lives and appreciate their sacrifices that they made.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, let's get to it.
Let's do it.
You can't climb the ladder of success with your hands in a pocket.
We will not go quietly into the night.
They tell me you're a man with true grit.
I am the one who knocks.
Don't ever tell me what I can't do, ever!
That's how winning is done.
Okay, so yeah, I liked what you said as we started. Just there's a lot of division in the country right now, and whether you're left, right, center, or whatever, there's a lot of good out there. I think a lot of times we focus on the bad, or we focus on what we don't like. And I think there's a lot more things that we have in common that we do like and that we can enjoy as a country that's out there. So it's interesting. Today we're going to be talking about some of these founding fathers. There's lots of founding fathers that were at the beginning part of the growth and the formation of this country itself. And I wanted to say as well with founding fathers is that there's a lot of men that
and women,
that were part of signing the Constitution, everything's like that. But there are so many women that are as well part of the formation of this country that I think a lot of times kind of go underlooked, and you don't particularly hear those types of stories. But I just thought it was important to mention as well.
One of the stories that I'm going to share today has a woman in it.
Good.
So,
yeah, and I think a lot of times it's easy to look backwards at some of these founding fathers and say, oh, well, he did this and he did that and he had an affair or he did this or whatever it may be, and to look back and say, oh, well, he's a terrible person. But the only one that's perfect is not us, right? I mean, every single one of us is imperfect. And if our standard of holding people is perfection, then I don't think that's a fair standard.
Yeah, I agree.
And especially in this time where people were really trying to create freedom and create a future for themselves and their posterity, it's easy to look back, and if you dig hard enough, you can find dirt on anyone. Any of these founding fathers. Oh, well, they did this and it's bad, so let's never talk about them again. I don't think that's completely right. If someone looked into my past and picked out every bad thing that I've ever done, then I would say
that leaves no room for improvement or bettering yourself. But you could argue that. I mean, you look at anybody who's ever done anything great, and there's probably something that they have done great. History's not so black and white as people think. And, you get people that do really great things, people that. And they might have some issues in their personal life. I mean, great artists, great actors, or great philosophers. Sometimes they have demons in their own life.
Yeah,
and so that can be.
Yeah, and I think as a whole, you want to be able to look back and say that person contributed a net positive in this life and in their life. So
that's the idea, right? Could just be net positive in this life.
yeah. That's everyone's hope. But someone who I'm going to talk about today, who I picked as kind of an American hero that I've always really kind of stood behind, it's a little bit harder to find that dark side for. And I don't know if it's just because maybe it was really a long time ago or because he was really that good of a guy. But I'm going to be talking about George Washington.
Classic.
Yeah, and it's really cool. So George Washington was born in February 22nd, 1732 in Virginia.
The 30s.
Yeah, and so he came from a very prominent family. His I think grandfather had come over in like 1655 or something like that, and from Great Britain, and so he was a generational colonist. And
first generation colonist.
Yeah.
I guess his dad came over, so
his grandfather came over.
Okay,
actually.
grandfather. Yeah.
So he had those roots, and he was a generation of I guess purebred Americans at that point. I guess they weren't called Americans because they were still
colonists.
They were still the 13 colonies, the colonists. Yeah. They were still underneath the rule of Great Britain at that time.
Do you remember where he moved to? Where he lived? Oh, it was Virginia.
Yeah, it was Virginia. Yeah, he was born in Virginia, and that's kind of where their family property was, in Mount Vernon. And that was where he lived, and then he went and basically lived his whole life within the war and then the presidency and everything else, and then he went and he retired back in Mount Vernon. A little bit about, really, I'm going to share a couple of stories about George Washington that I really liked. But to start out, I want to just give some brief background around the Revolutionary War. He was a key military leader in the American Revolutionary War. Some people call it the War of Independence as well. And that war was from 1775 to 1783.
1775? Yeah. Was the Declaration signed in 1776?
1776, yeah. So I guess officially the war started with what they call the shot heard around the world at Lexington and Concord.
Okay.
And then at that point, I think it just continued to grow. But I think the 72
was that the shot heard? Was that the?
That was some of the colonists basically got in an altercation with some
the Boston. What was it with the snow fight, and then they got into a tough with the soldiers?
Yeah, they did, and basically that was kind of it was already a tinderbox.
Yeah.
I mean, the colonists and the occupying British forces,
redcoats.
Yeah, they were at arms with each other.
Yeah.
And really the kind of the main reason behind the war was the 13 colonies obviously were declaring their independence from Great Britain, but it was over taxation and a lack of colonial representation in the Great Britain Parliament. And there had
no taxation without representation.
Yeah, no taxation without representation. And it was interesting because I was reading and I like historical accounts anyway. But I was reading, and I guess there was a lot of wars that, Great Britain at that time they were colonizing all over the world, and they had lots of colonies, and they were taking over nations and different things like that. And
the sun never sets on the British Empire, right?
Yeah, kind of like the Roman Empire, and it was just it was really expensive. And so, to a certain extent, the colonists, after some of these major wars, the British government, they were hurting financially, and so that is where some of that taxation, a lot of that taxation came, is that the colonists, they didn't want to be responsible for paying for the wars of what they felt was a completely different country, because they were autonomous. I mean, you have to think at that time, it took, 3 months to send a message across or longer, however long it took to send a message across the Atlantic in order to, even communicate. So they were completely independent. They ran their own society. They ran their own government to a certain extent, but they were still under the rule and taxation laws of this overarching governance of Great Britain. So,
yeah. Thanks for the history rundown.
Yeah. So George Washington, right? There are many reasons why I think George Washington was really a great leader. And I was going through some of the battles that I thought kind of stuck out to me. And there's really a lot of different points that I felt that he demonstrated that leadership, whether it was leadership for the protection of his men. There was a lot of controversy between the military and basically Congress and the government at that point, right? There was liaisons from Congress that they would send out to the military, to George Washington's forces, and they would basically go out there to check and see how things were. But there are certain parts of the war where the troops were starving, they were freezing and dying. I mean, they were dying by the thousands throughout the winter because they weren't receiving the supplies that they needed to not only survive but to battle. And George Washington would just send letter after letter after letter begging Congress and the government to send more aid. We need more. You know, we're dying here. More people are dying that in some of these winters than are by opposing forces. And they would send liaisons, and there's some stories of some of these government liaisons would come out and they would say, "Oh, everything's fine," and because they just wanted power. But George Washington, he's
like, "It's not fine. Look at this."
Yeah, seriously, there's people dying, and it's not fine. And so he was really torn over that, and he basically dedicated most of his life to bettering this country and building something for future generations, for us to continue to move forward. So, one of my favorite stories of George Washington is it's called the Newburgh Conspiracy. And
is this a conspiracy theory, or is this a
no?
true
This is a true conspiracy.
Okay.
Basically, it was towards the end of the war, the government, the United States government at that point, the independent government, they were broke, and they had promised military officers. They had promised them their salary throughout the war, and then they promised them a 50% pension for the rest of their life. That was, for these military officers, and there was a lot of them. I don't know how many, but there was a lot, and they were getting close to the end of the war, and they hadn't been paid for several months or even up to a year in some cases already. And the horizon looking for, what is our pension going to look like? It had still remained unfunded, and there was little hope on the horizon that it was actually going to be realized.
Oh, man.
And that they're actually going to receive it. So that's like the rest of their life, and they're not receiving what they were promised their compensation would be. And so that's where kind of there was a military coup that started cooking up between all of these military officers. And the officers, they band together basically with hopes to overthrow Congress and basically take over the government. The military would take over the government. And this was in Newburgh. That's where the fort was that they were stationed at. And this is where kind of all of this coup started up. Well, a couple of these officers, they put together the Newburgh Papers, or the Newburgh Letters, I think is what it was called. And basically it was like their plans. And as part of that letter, some of the officers, they took it to George Washington, who was unaware of this at this point. They took it to George Washington and say, "This is what we are thinking, and we want you to be king."
Really?
Yeah. And basically, it wasn't a generational kingship. I think they called it a congressional king or constitutional king, something like that, where it was more of a. It wasn't like his son was going to be king after him, and it was going to be king after him, and king after him. So, but they wanted him to be king, and what my favorite part of the story is George Washington's response to that. So literally, he was in command of these forces. He could have charged the
White House.
it was in Philadelphia at that point, I think, and they could have charged there. They could have taken over Congress, and he could have ruled the entire nation. I think our country would look significantly different if that was the case.
Yeah.
But he was the type of guy, I feel like he was humble enough to where he wasn't seeking power like that. You know, he basically, his response was an immediate, absolutely not. We literally just fought and died to get away from that.
Yeah, totally.
And I'm not going to send our country, our free country, right back into it by doing that. So he called a meeting all together with all the military leaders, or there's several different accounts that say that he actually barged into one of their meetings that they were holding, one of their planning meetings, and he went up in front of them and he gave a very powerful speech to them, and basically was telling them, don't do this. What did he say? He said, so he refused to be their king, and he pleaded with them to trust and support Congress and the government that they had created, that they had spent all this time to create. And most of the men at that time trusted him, and they backed down. They agreed. He convinced them not to do it. I'm sure that there were some that were still probably upset and wanted to do it, but they respected him enough to say, you know what? Okay.
Yeah. But he got into the presidency anyway. So I think the real kicker is when he stepped down as president, or he allowed another president to be voted in. That's the peaceful transfer of power is really what makes a democracy work.
Yeah, for sure. And so he got to that point, and actually he ended up being kind of pivotal in the conversations to Congress, and what they ended up figuring out for these military officers was they paid them all their back pay, and then they paid them a full salary for 5 years instead of the half pension for the rest of their life.
Oh, wow.
So, obviously I'd prefer probably the half pension for the rest of my life. Well, I don't know.
Well, and in those times, the life expectancy was shorter.
I guess that's true. And these military officers were probably in there. I think it was like in 1866, the life expectancy was like 40 something, like mid 40s. And so
it's not very old at all.
Yeah, so maybe I would have taken the 5 years. But he had a chance at that point to be king, and he didn't do it. His humility and probably true belief of the progression of this country as a whole, he didn't feel that he was large enough to take away from those future generations. So that's something really cool about George Washington that I saw.
And that is a cool story. I didn't know about that. The whole that Newburgh conspiracy. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
One of the guys that I had chosen, he was one of the other signers of the Declaration of Independence. In fact, I just had a little blurb here about the other one. It says there was 56 of them total. It says 5 of the 56 were captured by the British and tortured. 12 lost their homes through looting, confiscation, or burning them to the ground. 17 lost their fortunes. 2 lost sons in the military, while another 2 sons were captured, and 9 lost their lives. And so it just goes to show the sacrifice of these 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence. One of them, his name was Thomas Nelson Jr. And it's just kind of funny. Our mom had said, "Oh, we're related to this guy," and so I actually looked it up how we're related to this guy, and it's like 11th cousin once removed. I mean, he's so far away. It's like basically anybody, random person on the street, I'm probably more closely related to them than I am this guy.
Hey, blood is blood, man.
But it's so far back, and then in a different line, and then almost equally far down. So it's just kind of funny. But his story is really cool. So he was a son of a merchant family, wealthy merchant family, and him and his dad were involved in several colonial boycotts at the time. He lived in Virginia, so he inherited a large fortune. They were really against the whole taxation thing, and at age 23, he was elected to the House of Burgesses, which was one of the kind of organizational bodies at the time, and then he actually was one of the leaders of the Yorktown Tea Party, which dumped 154 pounds of tea into the Yorktown River. So it's not as big as the Boston Tea Party, but it's one of the more, but it's another one just like it. And in fact, it was a key point in like kind of getting in that vigor for those people who wanted to revolt against the British. So it got those people on their verge of revolution. In 1775, he was elected to fill George Washington's spot in Virginia, and the Second Continental Congress. He filled his seat because George Washington was called to be the commander of the Continental Army. And so
nice.
Kind of goes together. In 1781, he was elected to succeed Thomas Jefferson as the governor of Virginia. And then, so his story is kind of interesting. He, as being in the governor of the state in 1781, which is kind of later in the war, he got together a huge militia of men. They thought that there was a bunch of British forces that were going to crash into the Virginia, and so he actually went around, scrapped up like 300 men. He was like, "We're going to defend it," and they actually ended up going somewhere else for that time. But then he kind of grew his militia. I think his militia at one point got to like 3,000 men. And he was right in the thick of the battle. And one of the stories from him that I really liked was, well, two things. This guy sacrificed, he had a big fortune, like I said, and in 1780, he signed a loan from himself of $2 million towards the war effort. $2 million in 1780.
That's a lot of money.
Imagine how much money that is. And he did it against his own collateral. I think that's what he had for the war effort. And at the Battle of Yorktown, it was a pretty bad battle, and it had been going on for several days. And George Washington was there, actually. And French troops as well came up to support. In fact, that was Marquis de Lafayette. He was there as well. And they were at a position where they were on... they were shooting cannons, and the British had taken over his own house, and they were occupying his own house. And the soldiers were shooting, but they didn't want to shoot his house. They knew it was his house because they respected him. And he's like, "Guys, shoot my house." He said, "I'll give 5 guineas to the first soldier who shoots my house with a cannon." And the guys were still kind of reluctant, so he takes a cannon by himself, aims it at the house, lights it off, fires the first cannon shot at his own house. So it just goes to show, you know, in those days, it's not like you had homeowners insurance. You know, that's destroying his own property, his own fortune to destroy the British. And then, you know, other soldiers got into it, and they said that, you know, 6 to 10 cannonballs like went through his house, and it didn't totally destroy his house, but it definitely made an impact if you were inside that thing.
Yeah,
Can you imagine
that's
being
pretty
inside
crazy.
a house and having cannonballs come through? Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that at that story that he was willing to sacrifice his own house, and you know, after the war, he was kind of left a really poor man. That $2 million loan that he had made was actually never repaid. You know, he said the government was basically broke.
Mm-hmm.
He never actually got that paid back. Oh man, getting a bunch of calls here or something. So he never actually got that paid back, and so he was kind of destitute for the rest of his life. In fact, he had 11 children, and at the age of 50, he died from asthma. So it's just kind of sad.
Wow.
But,
Yeah,
you know,
for sure.
it just goes to speak of the sacrifice that he made, his fortune. And that's kind of like what it says at the end of the Declaration of Independence. Actually, one interesting other point, he was buried in an unmarked grave so that the creditors wouldn't know where his body was, so they couldn't hold it against him, hold it as collateral. And so I thought that was really cool. And one other piece that's here is that at the end of the Declaration of Independence, it says that these signers, and it says, for support of this declaration with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And I feel like he exemplified, that sentence.
Yeah, I really like that. Yeah, that's a cool story. It's kind of cool. Yeah, maybe we're related to him way over there, but it's still cool to have those stories of, whether it's just a relative or just a founding fathers. I like that.
Yeah, so kind of cool. What story? The story. I have another cool story that actually has to do with George Washington as well. But
go ahead with that one.
You want me to do that one too?
Yeah, go ahead with that one.
You sure?
Yeah.
Okay. So this one is kind of cool. This was about a guy named Christopher Ludwig, and he's called the Gingerbread Man. That's kind of a cool nickname.
Yeah.
But so this guy has an amazing history, and just his sacrifice. He sacrificed in a really different way. He wasn't like a war hero. His story is kind of cool. So at the age of 17, he fought in the Austrian and Persian armies and became familiar with military life doing that. He was a German. He traveled the world as a merchant sailor for 8 years, from 1740 to the 1750s. He came to Pennsylvania in 1754, and he realized that there was a market for gingerbread, selling gingerbread in Pennsylvania. And so he's like, okay, he went back to London. He went to London, spent 9 months honing his baking skills and whatnot. And then in 1754, he set up shop in Pennsylvania with a bakery, and he became actually very successful. He ended up owning 9 different properties and a farm because of he became successful with his bakery. And then the war broke out, and he was a patriot. And in fact, according, there was the treasurer of the United States at the time, and also signed the Declaration of Independence. His name was Benjamin Rush. He spoke about this guy's character. He said, he was much esteemed by all who did business with him for his integrity and punctuality, and for his disposition to do kind offices.
Yeah.
And so, very good guy. And
a self-made man.
Yeah, exactly. And then, so during the Revolutionary War, he was so grateful for the opportunities that America had provided him and his family, because his wife was right alongside him, and that he was very eager to join into the effort. He actually purchased a lot of arms and weapons for the soldiers, and had that. And one of the things that, I don't know if you remember, that there were lots of Haitian mercenaries that the British had hired to come fight, and he was an advocate for working with those POWs to telling them how great America was, and say, come over to dissent, join America, and see how great it is to live here. It's great. I build a life here. There's freedom here. And
just to clarify, so Haitian mercenaries, that's not from Haiti.
No,
that's from Germany.
Germany, yeah. German. The German mercenaries, basically a hired army by the British. And it's kind of funny that actually a lot of them did dissent and come over, and he would help them acclimate to American life and teach them how great America was and how to get just acclimated to the life around here. I think that's so cool how he was such a patriot in that sense, and he was an immigrant himself. He really just adopted that American lifestyle, and then he helped others do the same. And so one of the interesting things is that he became, in kind of the late 1770s, he became the Baker General of the Constitutional Army, and was made sure that every camp had the proper stoves, supplies, and right people with the right skills. So at the time, he actually commanded a company of over 70 bakers, and so quite a bit. And at the time, previous to him, the bakers would say get X many pounds of flour from the government. They said, okay, here's the flour for the war effort, and these bakers would bake all the stuff they had to, and then they would take up to 30% of it for their own use and sell it in their own bakeries. And so they were basically stealing from the government. And this guy was like, no, we're not having any of that. So he put a stop to all that, and he basically refined this whole thing. So he was at Valley Forge in the winter of 1777, 1778, and he fed all those men during that winter. You talked about how much winter can kill those guys.
Yep, that was the winter that I was mainly talking about.
And he was there, man. He was feeding those guys, and that's a hero in his own right. I mean, you talk about war heroes, and you talk about this guy was feeding those guys. Really cool. And then at the Battle of Yorktown, where Cornwallis surrendered, he was ordered by George Washington to make 6,000 pounds of bread over the course of a day, or 2 or 3 days. And so him and his wife, which I think is really cool, him and both his wife made that. And I'm sure they had some other people do, but his wife was with him that whole time, and she was working with him. So she was an American patriot as well. And I'm sure that she was involved. You know, we don't have that much of a history on her, but we know that it said that she was involved with that. Her name was Catherine England Ludwig. And so kind of cool there. And, you know, whether they gave those cakes to some of the British soldiers that had surrendered, you know, it's possible. But he was there, and he helped support that war effort. Just a little bit more about, so after the war, he got back, and he really found that his estate was in shambles. He had lost lots of livestock. He had lots of his buildings were in shambles. He lost most of his wealth. He spent the next 5 years petitioning the government for some restitution because he had put in a lot of money, and he only got a very small amount back in the end. Excuse me. In fact, he actually petitioned George Washington to write a letter to Congress and say, "Hey, can you kind of vouch for me?" And this is what George Washington said. He said, "I have known Mr. Ludwig from an early period of the war, and have every reason to believe, as well from observation as information, that he has been a true and faithful friend and servant to the public, that he has detected and exposed many impositions which were attempted to be practiced by others in his department." That's that 30% I was talking about, the scraping off the top. That he has been the cause of much saving in many respects, and that his deportment in public life has afforded unquestionable proofs of his integrity and worth. With respect to his losses, I have no personal knowledge, but have often heard that he has suffered from his zeal in the cause of this country. So that's quite the letter. Recommendation
letter,
yeah. George Washington, a good friend. You call him a good friend. And interestingly enough, he died at 80 years of age. In 1801. So like double life expectancy. So I think that's a really cool story of a patriot, not necessarily a war hero, someone who was an immigrant. They came here, they wanted to create a better life, and they did that. And they had the support of his loving wife. You know, they say behind every great man is an amazing wife, right?
I completely agree with that.
And so I think that's a cool story.
Yeah, I like the point of that story that he was actually an immigrant, right? And so he came over and he saw the potential and the opportunity with this great country in and of itself, and he fought for that. I mean, he sacrificed for that. And I think there's a lot of even immigrants today that have the opportunity to come and either work in the United States or live and grow and meet people. And I think many of those people would probably say similar, that the United States is an amazing place to be, even with the some of the confusion and unrest that exists today. I think a lot of them would say, I would prefer to stay than go back.
Absolutely. And not only that, is that I like that he adopted the American lifestyle. He added his uniqueness to America, and he also helped others adapt, and he became a patriot. And he loved this country. He loved what it stood for. He put his money and everything in. And, you know, it's sad that at the end of the war, he couldn't get a lot of his money back because basically the country was broke. But, you know, I appreciate his sacrifice, and I'm sure all those soldiers did on those cold winter nights in 1778.
They had a little bit of bread to eat.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a good story. The last patriot that I wanted to talk about was something that kind of hits a little bit close to home, right? So I want to talk about Francis Marion. So
that's a good one.
Yeah. So Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox is basically what his nickname was. And I say it's close to home because our grandmother lives in the Francis Marion National Forest, and that's where my dad grew up for most of his life. I guess our dad.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Hey, and also I drive through there every time I go to the beach.
Yeah, and it's close. It's close by. And so it's called the Francis Marion National Forest, and
It's a swamp.
Yeah, it's a swamp. That's why they call them the swamp fox. But one of the coolest stories that I think, actually, in the movie The Patriot,
with Mel Gibson.
Yeah, with Mel Gibson, that main character, he's kind of a conglomerate of a couple historical guys. But one of the people that they based a lot of his the movie off of was Francis Marion. And one of the things that they would do is that they knew the swamps of South Carolina and the South really, really well. I mean, they knew them well. And so there's a lot of things in those swamps that you don't want to mess with, especially at night. And
alligators.
Yeah, alligators and just all kinds of stuff that's just it's super easy to get lost and disorientated and everything else. So they would go and attack the British, and then they would run, and him and his troops, and then when they would get to the edge of the swamp, they would turn around and they would wave at the British, and then they would go into the swamp.
Come and get us.
Yeah, come and get us, because they knew that those British, if they had any experience at all, they would not follow them.
And you can't get any artillery or horses in there.
Nope.
You're basically just men going through the swamp, and then you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah.
You're focusing on the environment, and you get taken out.
Yeah, but if you know the environment, if you know the path, there's probably certain trails and paths and safe ground that Francis Marion and his guys under his control, or under his command is what the word I was looking for. Under his command, that they knew all that stuff. And so that's just one of the coolest stories. And I know that him just being a patriot and using his environment to fight invading forces, right, and to fight the British.
That's a great. Francis Marion's a great story. That reminds me of like one of the cool stories about Charlotte, North Carolina, where we the area where we live. They said that I think there was a letter that was sent by a British general to General Cornwallis that said that Charlotte was a hornet's nest of rebellion. And so that's where the Charlotte Hornets, the basketball team, that name comes from, is because people didn't give up, man. Or the Tar Heels, right? The name the Tar Heels. You know where that comes from?
Yeah, they said that that when the boys from the good old boys from North Carolina went into battle, it was like they would never retreat, right? It was like their heels were stuck to the ground with tar.
Yeah.
I think that's
yeah, that is it. That sounds like that's like a Spartan thing, man. Like never retreat, never
surrender.
You either come back on your shield or with it, right?
Yeah.
It's cool. But those stories of patriotism, those stories of people who died so that I today can have my freedoms, I appreciate that so much, and that makes me think, what am I doing? What sacrifices am I making so that my kids, can benefit off of that? Because a lot of these people, at least the people I shared my stories with, they did not really benefit at all from this. In fact, their lives were almost ruined. But their children's lives and the generations after that, immensely affected. So I think that's just such a cool and powerful long-sightedness that we see lacking these days. People just are short-sighted, or they don't have that delayed gratification. I mean, doing things for your great-grandchildren is kind of out of some people's minds.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And it's, foregoing that immediate gratification that in today's day and age, with basically we live in an age of instant gratification, is a lot different than, back then, basically giving up everything that you had built up, even your family's entire fortune. Imagine having $2 million, or back then maybe $200 million today,
and giving it all to
giving it all to the cause in hopes that your family and your grandchildren, your great grandchildren will have a better life. And it's like, well, will $200 million give them a better life, or will freedom and independence give them a better life?
Yeah, because you think about those guys who were rich, and people knock on the rich and say, oh, they were way better off. But yeah, those guys were rich, and they still gave everything. They could have been totally fine under the British rule. And they would have been, with $2 million, or you could live a nice life. But he decided to give all that away, not just, I don't think just selfishly, but for the people and for the cause of what it meant. So kind of cool. His name is, or at least some of these guys' names are enshrined on the Declaration of Independence, and some of them are not, and I think they're equally important.
Yeah, I completely agree. So the question we have is, who is your favorite founding father out there?
Yes,
So,
and if you have one, share it with us, or maybe not founding father, but or American hero. So definitely share that with us. I think this has been a great discussion, a great podcast. Thank you all for listening. We really appreciate the support we've been getting, and we've been filming them. We're actually putting this one on YouTube as well, so check our videos out on YouTube, and you can see our shining faces.
Yeah.
And
follow us on Instagram at a.brothers.creed.
Mm-hmm.
We always post before our episode's released, kind of teasers and different things like that. So
maybe some inside stuff about the episode, or some pictures from people that we interview, which is kind of cool.
Yeah. So let's continue to have some more great podcasts, and let's build our creed together.